to make a change. Do it with some soul and a little make a change. You can't make a change unless you got some make a change. Do it with some soul and a little make a change. We started from the bottom, talking about the roots. Every time I'm in the booth, I gotta shoot the truth. My art is my art, it ain't no shame from it. I'm feeling like Kunta, they'll never take my name from me. History is history.
Race, conversations, and law enforcement. This is Moses' People Speak. Hello everyone, this is Terry Watson, the founder of Strategies for Justice. Today I'm so excited to have here as our guest Dr. Angelyn M. Anderson. I'm going to let her introduce herself, but we touched base a couple of days ago, and we had a great conversation. So thank you for your time and welcome to Moses' People Speaking.
Well, thank you so much, Terry. I'm happy to be here. We did have a good conversation. It kind of spun off of something totally unrelated. Yes. It's just interesting how that works.
That's most of my conversations these days. Well, first, I want to give people a chance to get to know who you are and about the work you've been doing. Today's topic that we're discussing is a presentation that you've done in the past. It was titled "The Moving Targets: The Lives and Legacies of Emmett Till, Trayvon Martin, and Mike Brown." So, a very important topic, and I'm so glad that you're here to discuss it today with us. So, can you just give us a little background about what you do and some of your passions?
What do I do? I've been in higher education for over 20 years now. That seems like a really big number. You don't think about that like when you're first starting out and then you blink and it's there, right? And so I've been in higher ed working with students face to face in various capacities. But my passion and I know my vocation is to kind of be a rebel rouser, I think.
I like that.
And I kind of stumbled into that and stumbled into higher ed as a undergrad student. I was very engaged at Illinois State University, really engaged in what we would now call social justice issues, NAACP, Black Student Union, those types of things, right? And those are the things that really spoke to me and kind of pulled at my heartstring. And then when I graduated undergrad and I realized, I don't have a job, I should probably figure that out or like go back to school. Okay, I'll go to school and get a grad degree. And I started in an English degree, believe it or not. Okay. And I did that for about 2 semesters because I felt like, hey, I want to teach African-American students in English because I was really irritated by how they were kind of told that their way of speaking was improper and that it wasn't right, I saw a lot of them in developmental English. And I was like, that's just kind of bothering me. Then I realized I needed a PhD to teach English, and I didn't love English that much. And then someone said to me, hey, have you thought about going into the higher ed program? And I was like, well, what's that? And they were like, it's doing all the stuff that you're doing right now. You're engaging students, you're being face to face. I was like, really? Sign me up. So I ended up going into higher ed and found my niche there, finished that degree, went on to work in housing and then student facing stuff with academic advising where I've been the majority of my career. But while doing that underlying calling of engaging people in the community, especially Black people, was there. It never left, right?
Right.
And so I had to figure out how to kind of get that fed and ended up pursuing another master's degree. One of my master's degrees, in addition to the one I have in education, I have a couple of them. One of them is actually in social justice. And I went to Loyola University, Chicago, and got that degree. And then from there, ended up into a doctoral program in ethical leadership, but decided that I wanted to look at the impact and the effects of gentrification. I live in Chicago. and I am a resident of the Bronzeville community, which is historic because
Yes, it
this
is.
is one of the places, this is Chicago's Black Harlem. And this is the place where people from the South flocked during the Great Migration. There are two waves of Black folks
Right.
coming to Chicago.
Right.
One wave came and settled on the South Side, Bronzeville area, other parts of the South Side. Another wave came and settled on the West Side. So you'll see a lot of residents in Chicago. Chicago's a very, we have neighborhoods, but we're
Right. Right.
also very segregated.
Right.
And so there's a win to that and there's a loss to that, right? Because
Right.
we have these distinct personalities in our neighborhoods, and Bronzeville is just so distinct and it's so just sacred, for lack of a better term. I can look down the street and see the home of Nat King Cole, like the
Wow.
childhood home of that. I can
Wow.
walk my dog and go and be by Ida B. Wells's home,
Wow.
you know, where she used to live, or Sing Stack and Abbott, all of those people, the Chicago Defender folks, Oscar DePriest, like all of that is within walking distance. And so I started seeing, after I purchased my home, literally maybe about 5 or 6 months after that, I started seeing condo buildings and homes going up. And I was like, ugh, this feels weird, right? My property value has gone up. I'm like, awesome. However, what is happening to our people that are here?
Correct.
And so that really was that's my heart's work, is really looking at being a consultant and engaging community members and trying to engage both sides of the table, community members as well as those in positions that are kind of reshaping and reworking what neighborhoods look like. And part of that to me was really looking at the fact that I'm a gentrifier. So when I did my research, my dissertation research, even though it was in leadership, I looked specifically at the effects of gentrification on historic and cultural preservation within the Black community. And my sticking point was, what does that look like when both the person that's gentrifying, so coming into the neighborhood, and the folks that are living in the neighborhood are both Black? And so that really brought in a very different layer, because most times we think wealthy, affluent, less wealthy, less affluent, white moving into Black or brown. And so that's the journey of how I kind of got, that's the long-winded version of how I ended up with trying to do my passions work now that I am able to focus and I'm done with school, and looking at how do I work with people within the community. As far as the conversation that you and I had a few days ago,
correct,
it was really looking at that time period where we had Trayvon Martin and we had Mike Brown, and I was blessed to have a colleague say, hey, I can't do this presentation at the Skokie Public Library. Would you be interested? And I was like, sure. And they were like, well, go ahead. And I was like, okay, cool. And then I didn't know what I was going to talk about. And then I looked at the news and I said, okay, we have to talk about this. Like, this is a reoccurring theme, right? And I wasn't sure how it would be received. I was in Skokie. While there is, at my institution, there is a mix of students culturally, and I don't like the term diversity because I think it's lost its flavor, and we can have a conversation about that later.
Oh, we probably should too.
It's like I have a love-hate relationship with that word.
Me
and
too.
I'll explain.
Me too.
We can have a conversation about that. But I wasn't sure how it would be received because we had, a high Jewish community, a high-level Jewish community there, in addition to residents from different backgrounds and walks. And when I started talking about what this looked like for Black men and how we needed to, one of the terms I use a lot when I'm doing that type of work is check your privilege. I had to explain to the people who were attending this workshop or this presentation. And it was the room. I walked in and I was like, okay, let me get set up. And then I looked around and there were a bunch of people. And I said, oh, okay. It's about to go down. I'm not quite sure how this is going to end. But I see that exit there and that one there. I'm good. And figuring out what I needed to do to kind of get that point across, because you don't have these honest dialogues, right? And I had to oftentimes tell people, check your privilege. when we're talking about what should have been done. They should have done this. They shouldn't have done that. Why didn't they say this? Why didn't they just comply?
Right.
You're coming from a place of privilege. And
Right.
we have to oftentimes check that privilege in order to have those deep conversations.
And you know what, too? I myself do a fair share of presentations, specifically on policing and race. But that's a very hard conversation to have, especially when people haven't had the experience of checking that privilege. So my question to you is, one, how has that conversation gone for you, and what advice would you give folks who are working in this field in having that conversation?
How has that conversation gone for me as far as when people have told me to check my privilege or when I've had to tell people to check theirs?
Ooh, that's deep. Let's talk about both of those because okay. So one cool thing about my presentation is I usually begin with my privilege. I am a big African American male. I understand there are some things that that I don't have to worry about that let's say, for example, a female would have to worry about. I talk about that when we talk about stuff like sexual assault and domestic violence, even though that's not, just the victims are not just female. Of course, there are male victims, but that's something I haven't had to grow up with that on my mind, right? I didn't have to have a talk about being safe or anything like that. But sometimes people don't have that internal self-reflection, right? So the first time you would say, check your privilege, they may that's probably a whole new concept for them. So in your experience, what have that been like when you told people that? And I'd be interested to know who who told you to do that.
Dear friends remind me often to check my privilege.
Hold on one second.
Right?
I think I lost your sound.
Is that better?
Oh.
Hello.
Go ahead, keep talking.
Okay. So I think that for me, the check your privilege conversation has been had with me. Dear friends have had to do that with me. And it's not necessarily me navigating the space of the world. It may have been with, the one example I think of is with looking at a family member. And you have those family members that you're just like, ooh, why can't they just do X, Y, Z?
Oh yeah.
You're like, it would be just so much easier. And I had a friend, they didn't say check your privilege. They use those exact words, but that's what the sentiment was. They were like, you know what? You're coming from a space of this. You need to cut that out. Because when you do this is what you do and how that impacts someone else. And I think it's really important. And this is something that I'm learning just as a professional. My mentors in the professional realm are like, you have to really understand intent versus impact.
That's
something that I work with personally every day, trying to figure that out. And that's a very thin line to walk. But when someone tells me that I had to check my privilege, I'm like, oh. Privilege? What are you talking about? And then they broke it down for me, because I think that privilege and sometimes judgment can go with one another. Right?
Gotcha. Right.
And so I'm sitting here looking at the situation. Why did they do that? Just doesn't make any sense. Why wouldn't they do it this way? It would be so much easier if they did it that way. And so while you're thinking that you're giving feedback to be helpful, you have to be careful that you're not judging, because your judgment is coming from essentially sometimes a place of privilege, because you are able to either see this from the outside looking in, or you have experiences that have shaped your ability to do that cognitive work and that self-reflection that they may not have developed yet. And so when you're sitting there and you're looking at them and you're judging and you're operating from that space of privilege, you got to step back and take a beat and really figure that out, right? That's when I know how that felt when people have come to me and say, you need to you need to check your privilege. I think the old folks would say, your slip's showing when they, your business is showing, your slip is showing right now. You need to fix that, right? The times that I've had to literally say, and I've literally said, check your privilege. One time was in that workshop, but I made it very clear because of the topic and because of the community that I was in and because of the demographic of people from various ages. I had a woman there who had brought her children who were maybe 10 or 11 and a little bit younger. I had people who were seniors. I had people who were international residents before they came here, and right. So you have to, I think it's really important that you develop a definition of what that privilege is so that everybody's on the same page, right? That's so if point. I had gone into that workshop and didn't have, I always do ground rules at the start of any workshop I facilitate.
Me too.
So that we can all be on the same footing, right?
Yep.
Step up, meaning that I need some people who haven't talked to step up a little bit more and say some thoughts. Step back. You've been talking too much. So I need you to step back and make space for somebody else to kind of say something. Check your privilege. You sound a little judgy there. So I need you to kind of I need you to breathe and think about somebody who doesn't have your experience, right?
Right.
They don't have your experience, and your experience now, and it can go the other way too, where you have someone who may be viewed as less privileged, but they have a wealth of knowledge, right? And they're talking to someone that may not have that same knowledge base. And they're like, well, how come you don't know that? Well, this should be this way. You gotta check your privilege too. Privilege isn't necessarily about status. Like that's a layer of privilege. Right. Your status, your standing in society, your bank account, your finances, your education, your formal education. Right. And there are other sides to that dynamic too, where you can have an education that's not through a formalized institution, where that doesn't mean it's any less than, it's just going to be different, right? And it may be less than in the sense of if you're not operating from the same definitional framework, right? So really talking to people about understanding what their privilege is. And some people, they are willing to be reflective. I can think of one instance where this woman, I wasn't even facilitating. I think I was in we had just done microaggression training at my institution. And the way that it worked out was we did our training in like a day or two. And then that second or third day, I can't remember how long our training was. That second or third day, the facilitator was actually facilitating an actual microaggression workshop.
Gotcha.
And so part of our training was to sit in that workshop as participants, but also as disruptors.
Right.
So we're like, how am I going to disrupt? I'm still trying to process this, right?
Right.
And you want me to be paying attention and thought enough from the perspective of a disruptor versus someone that's like, yo, you just need to be quiet, right? That internal innate survival skill that you have, right?
Right.
And so there was a woman I can think of who was an educator at a fairly large educational entity. I'll leave it at that.
Gotcha.
Entity in the Chicago area. And some of the things, and she was international.
Okay.
And so some of the things that she was saying, I'm sitting there looking at her like this, like in complete and utter awe, like, ma'am, you're a naturalized citizen. You weren't a citizen that was born and raised here. And the way that you're talking to people who are born and raised here is very disrespectful. Like, very disrespectful. Like, you're just, even if you, and taking that out, like, even if you were born and raised here, the tone and what was being said was very disrespectful. And and this person really thought that they were being helpful to their students. They worked at an educational entity, a fairly large one that impacted all of Chicago through a variety of communities. And some of the things that they were saying, I'm sitting there looking like the bulk of the people that you work with look like me. as far as their student base, as far as your colleagues, they look like me. And if you are behaving this way, and now you're confused as to why your students that look like me in a community that is predominantly people who look like me aren't coming to you for assistance.
Right.
You need to check your privilege. And no sooner than I would say that, she would have a response to say, right? Mm-hmm. And it wasn't even, she wasn't listening. And so I finally just said, it was funny because the facilitator was laughing. She was kind of giggling because the person would say something and I would say, well, I hear what you're saying. I honor that. But what I want you to do is kind of think about this question. And I would ask the question and say, I want you to think about it. And they would come back and answer. I said, no, I need you to stop talking. I need you to sit there and think about it. Let the next comment go. Let somebody else comment, and then we'll come back to you. They kept pushing. And I said, let the next two people talk, and then just sit in this for a minute, and we'll come back to you. And it literally got up to I said, okay, look, there are 4 other people that have their hands raised. I really need for you to stop your answer. You're listening for me to stop talking and for the pause for you to jump in with what your answer is. And the reason that your students are not coming to you is because you're doing this. You need to sit in that uncomfortableness. So there are 4 other people that are talking. So let those 4 people talk before you say another word about this question.
Wow.
And had to sit there, and it was eating them up because she didn't know what to do. She didn't know what to do.
You had to educate the
privilege.
Yeah, you had to educate the educator.
Right, and I was so concerned. I was like, this person is working with students who are first generation college students who are not just traditional age, but this particular class that they were teaching, the demographic had more adult learners in it than traditional age. So there's some additional barriers they're dealing with, right?
Right.
And you're coming in with this mentality, you're not helping them. You don't understand why you're not getting, why you're sitting. And they came out and said, I don't understand why I'm sitting in my office hours and no one's coming to me for office hours. Woo, well.
Wow. So, I want to dive into the topic of today too, because you mentioned some really good key points here, and I thank you for sharing that, especially when we're talking about trying to provide education to folks around a topic that is sometimes tense. And so tell me about the presentation, moving targets. That's what it's called too, right? Moving targets.
Right.
And you have a really interesting perspective. One, Chicago side, and I wear my Chicago Bulls shirt. That's not a that's not a coincidence, by the way. I told you
over everything. Right, Chicago over everything. Chicago over everything. Even if we are having losing seasons, that's okay.
I love my Bulls. I'm sorry, I love my Bulls. But going back to what I was saying, the trauma that comes from the stories of Emmett Till, Trayvon Martin, Mike Brown. I would love if you could give us some insight to what that presentation was like, and also what were some of the responses you got from that community.
That presentation was a little intense, right? Because really having people sit there and hear me talk about these men, right? For a lot of those people that were there, I'm just going to it's just in all transparency, the majority of those people there, the closest they would ever come to something like that is what they were getting, which was the news, right?
Oh, yeah.
That was it, that engagement.
Wow.
They didn't know firsthand. Now, there were some people in there who were advocates who weren't African-American, right? But most of the people in there were getting this experience from the news and that narrative.
Wow.
And so really making it so that it wasn't, I kind of look at it as a funnel where you have all of this big stuff, right? And then you're pouring something into the funnel because you want to get it down to that smaller to fit into a bottle or whatever the container is. That's the amount you're putting in. You can't just pour it all in. You got to funnel it down. Right. And so being able to really break it down to where these were people, they weren't just what you see on the news. They weren't just well, I heard he did X, Y, and Z. They weren't just oh, well, the police have a very challenging job and people need to comply. Though they weren't just those conversations. They were people, they had families, they had friends, they had experiences that were all valuable.
Right.
And understanding that it's easy for you to turn away from that because you have privilege.
Right.
You're not living in that community. You're not waking up and looking at your Black male loved ones go out the door and you're thinking, I hope they come back. Right? Even if you're not verbally saying it, you still have that sigh of relief when that person walks in the door. You don't have that. You don't have to deal with that, right? And just really, my goal was to really make them more than headlines, to make them tangible, right? And to make them humans, and to say, here are some of the things that people did. You know, why didn't he just stop when Zimmerman walked up to him and was having a conversation with him? Why didn't he just stop? Well, he didn't have to fight him. You know, who are you to say that?
Right.
Who are you to say that? Because if he doesn't fight, he's gonna die. If he does fight, he's gonna die. Emmett Till didn't fight. They came and snatched him up out of his relative's bed.
Right.
And the family gave him, because that was the way. It was like, what are we supposed to do?
And you know what's, I'm sorry, you know what's interesting too is when you mention that, I talk a lot about generational trauma. And I'm not the only one. I know there's a lot of scholars out there that talks about generational trauma. And you bring up Emmett Till, and my first question with that and is, when you look at Emmett Till, the story of Emmett Till, and then as you just talking about the story of Trayvon Martin, have you seen a parallel between mindsets, or have things changed in your opinion?
Have I seen parallels between the Trayvon Martin and Emmett Till and Mike Brown and Philando Castile and you know, Sandra Bland, and do I see trends in that? Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, going back to your passion about generational trauma, we can't ignore that, because it's there. And even when we, I don't even want to say put on our armor as people, even when we prepare to hit the world as Black people, it's stuff that we just make it numb, right? And I think that's part of that generational trauma that we see, because it's something that has been repeated over and over and over again. It's a constant. And so you can't help but be impacted. We can't help but be triggered. You know, we can't help but have that change how we navigate the multiple spaces that we navigate, even the basic things of going to the store, right? And even now, with all of this going on with the pandemic, a lot of people that I know are having really bad insomnia, including myself, right? Because, and I truly believe that part of that is part of that generational trauma, because we're viewed as expendable. And here it is, we're in a space that, in a time and in an experience in which things are not okay, right? It's not okay. We got sickness around us, and there are certain things that are about to happen because people are just being hard-headed and won't sit down and stay home, right? So then what does that do when law enforcement has to be aggressive in their enforcement of the shelter in place? We just shut down our lakefront and parks here in Chicago. The mayor was looking at us like, didn't I tell you to sit down? And so you're not sitting down. So now me and the governor have to shut down this stuff. Like, literally, the police cars have blocked off the path. And it's going to be 58 degrees on Saturday. It was raining and snowing today. It was warm yesterday, but it's going to be 58 degrees on Saturday here in Chicago. And you shut down our lakefront. If you're not familiar with Chicago, our lake runs all the way from the north side. You can get on Lakeshore Drive and literally drive along the lake and have a view of the lake from the far north side, or some of the far north suburbs, all the way to the south side of the city.
Wow.
And you just shut that down. And so I think just feeling that and knowing that we as Black people prepare a little bit differently for this stuff. Like, it's in our DNA that we know we have to do certain things. My grandparents, whom I'm fussing at, they're 80 something years old. Why are you going to the store? I have frozen food that I packaged and frozen. Call me, I will bring it to you. I know my germs. You don't know the germs of the people that are out there, right? And so for them, it's just like, I mean, we had to deal with the depression. I know how to make food last. I know how to, so that, you know, that generational trauma there. So you have that that's passed on. And so I think that it's really important to acknowledge it, which we acknowledge it. But at some point, what do we do to break it? And that's when people start getting angry, because it's like, I'm done acknowledging. I'm ready to deal with it, right?
Yes.
So
I gotta tell you right now, that was a point. I was part of a meeting recently, and we were talking about when people talk about acknowledging issues in diversity and equity, right? There's a time and a place for acknowledgement, but that should not be the end all. And so I'm glad you made that point about the difference between acknowledging something and actually having a plan to address it. So, you know, thinking about the three stories. And actually, you mentioned Sandra Bland and Philandro, which were. I'll tell you right now. I'm doing interviews with police officers, right? And one of the questions I asked them is, when you hear the phrase "Black Lives Matter," what's the first thing that comes to mind? And we then engage in that conversation. Everyone I've done so far, the Philandro case comes up. And this is really important too, because the folks who are interviewed, if you talk about humanizing folks, they're liberal, they're conservatives, they're Democrat, Republicans, Black, white, you name it. But they all had the same point of view towards the Philandro case, which was murder. Now, I want to highlight that we're talking about law enforcement, people who I'm interviewing, talking about this case as being murder. However, as you know, with this case, the police officer was brought to trial, but there was no indictment. So that meaning that a jury believed that Philandro made this police officer so nervous that they found it justifiable for him to pull the trigger. That's probably one of the and so generational trauma is when you're looking at it from the perspective of not just how it impacts us, but how does it impact the mindset of our whole country. So I'm interested about your perspective on when you're looking at the movements. Because I imagine that's part of the conversation that you had, the movement of Black Lives Matter and the movement of Blue Lives Matter. Was that discussed in your presentation as well?
I touched on police interaction a little bit, and how it's angering to hear people say, well, if they would have just. And I don't know who makes me angrier when I hear that. When I hear someone that's coming from a place of privilege and safety say it, or when I hear someone that looks like me say it. Like, I don't, like, it just doesn't end well at all. And so a colleague and I had an opportunity after I did this particular presentation we had an opportunity, and it was either after or before. We had an opportunity to do a presentation at the time at Loyola University's Black Lives Matter conference.
Okay.
And we actually then collectively did a presentation entitled "Hell Yeah, I'm Angry: The Silence Sandra Bland and the Silencing of Black Women," because at that point, your facial expression just said it all. At that point, we're like, man, we're not even safe, right? So how do you reconcile that I may be the one not coming home because of just what's been ingrained into society and what's been ingrained into the people that are in position of power? Because I think there's a difference between power and authority.
Absolutely.
You could be in a position of power, but not have the knowledge as someone that's being oppressed, not have the same knowledge base, right? You know, you can be mediocre and run through the ranks of wherever.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that you are an authority on something. Right. You're just in a place of power. Right. And so we really did focus on how, in that presentation, how Black women are being silenced and what that looks like, not just with police interactions, but also just in everyday existence, which led to us starting a podcast about that, which we're getting back into the groove of now that things have kind of settled down for them and for me being in school and all of that. Right. But I did touch on, to answer your question, to go back to your question, I did touch on how that's a really tricky dynamic in the Black community when it comes to police and community members, right? And then even more of a challenge when that officer looks like you. It kind of reminds me of that scene in Boys in the Hood, where the police officer, it was the Black guy that was giving them the most grief. The white officer was just like, yeah, okay, y'all don't need to be doing it. I shook you up enough. It was the Black one that's like, I'm coming for you. Wait, why I gotta have nightmares about you coming for me now after you done did this, you know, to make yourself to make yourself seem like one of the guys, right? Because the reality is, when it comes down to that blue line and you look like me, that blue line don't apply to you. It just doesn't. You're expected to stay in your place and toe the line and have that code of silence and do those things that are considered being a good officer and a good colleague. But when it comes time to defend you, a Black male or a Black female who wears that blue uniform, don't count on it.
Yeah, you know what? It's interesting that you mentioned that. You know, if you've been to my page, you notice that in the speakers section there is a bunch of law enforcement, either active or retired, or in some cases fired, who have spoken out, and some of the folks who I've talked to who was in law enforcement who have been outspoken, there has been this level of retaliation that comes with that, right? So I think of the story of Carriel Horn, who's one of the speakers that's on my platform, and she was fired for stopping a choking of a handcuffed suspect, and till today she doesn't have the support of the unions or you know, and her story, I tell you what, is very heartbreaking when you think about it, because when you fast forward to present day, the same officer that was choking that handcuffed man and punched her in her face for stopping it, he wound up going to jail for another situation. And so you would think common sense would be, okay, maybe 20 years ago, I didn't believe Carrier Horn, but in the new light of the situation, maybe we should reevaluate her situation. And still nothing. And he even though he went to jail and gets out, he still gets his pension, and she does not. And so, it's a interesting conversation when you have folks who do speak up, or officers who do break that code. I'm always hoping that we can find ways to support those folks, because we need officers like that. We need them to be conscious. I always say I don't want officers who are when I do my training for police, the most common question I get is, how do we hire and retain officers of color? And I say, well, please don't do that. I want you to have conscience officers who know what generational trauma is and how it impacts their community. That's the officers we want. We don't want people who's going to have the same mindset, but just a different skin tone. So, I'm looking at the time.
Back to my thing about diversity, like the word diversity.
Exactly.
I had an interview where they said, well, how do you define diversity? And I was like, oh, before I even realized it, I was like, I have a love-hate relationship with the word diversity. And they're like, whoa. So let me explain why.
Yes.
Diversity has now been boiled down to, let's look at your manuals, let's look at your marketing pieces, let's look at your marketing collateral, and does it look like you're representing a variety of people, differently abled, different complexions, different ethnicities, different races, different religious backgrounds, different gender and sexual identities. Are you representing that, right? That to me is what diversity has now become. And I don't want that. Like, I'm not here for that. I am definitely about equity. And if you are dealing with the equity challenge and dealing with the inequities that exist in society, and you start truly addressing that, and then looking at, I'm coming from a place of privilege, that's when you're going to start seeing, hopefully, that makeup of what people look like and representing your organization or your space or your group evolve to reflect those different demographics and dynamics that exist because of the lack of equity.
You know what? I look at the time here, and I'm so appreciative of your time with me. I do want to ask this final question, and I think it's very important. Is you spend a lot of time talking about gentrification, the importance of looking at equity, which I absolutely agree. Diversity has become like I actually removed that from my vocabulary in some ways. But thinking about the stories that you've researched and covered, as a community, how do you think we can heal? Like, what do you think are some of the steps we need to take to heal as a community?
I
said the best question for last always.
That's tough, because I don't think there's like one answer to that, right? I kind of go back to that whole intent versus impact, right? The intent for some of these policies and procedures and things that people do may be XYZ, but the way that they're impacting the community, you have to really get into those trenches and see how it's impacting the community to then kind of look for those trends and then kind of start to address them. But when we're looking at that and talking in relation to healing, one of the things that I think we really need to do is understand that healing process is going to require us to do some stopgaps, right? It's not okay, this is what you need. Okay, let me map this plan out. We're going to do X, Y, Z in this order and this particular time frame, and then you will be on the road to healing. Not when you have these generational traumas happening, right, that are there. They're embedded in it. Some people believe they're embedded in our DNA, right? We can't shake it.
Yep.
And then you're surrounded by leadership, like in the country right now. You get who's in charge of the country right now, creating more trauma on people, right? So how do you unravel that? Like, I don't think there's a surefire way to kind of unravel it. I think that one of the biggest things is we have to understand that, yes, healing needs to take place. and know that there's got to be stop gaps that are in place, because we're going to have to address some of those equity issues so that people do feel safe to be able to share what it is that they actually need. We can sit back and watch and say, oh, I'm seeing this gap. But until they are able to verbalize it, that's when the healing's going to start, and understand it's going to be really messy.
Well, you know what? I that's some deep stuff right there. That's a question I always ask myself, and trying to provide some perspective, because healing, it is a multifaceted approach that we have to take. You're right. Mm-hmm. There is no direct answer. So with that said, thank you so much for your time. This has been wonderful. I look forward to collaborating with you. I know I want you to share also. I know you said it's not like nuts and bolts tied down yet, and you are working on it. But can you share with everyone the project that you are working on right now? Because I think it's very exciting.
Okay, well, the project that I'm working on right now, which is what kind of connected us from the beginning, right?
Yes,
is I look at all of the different conferences that are out there for urban planning and urban planners, and just looking at community development stuff and economic development stuff. And to me, it just seemed very exclusive, right? Mm-hmm. Not everybody's going to be able to go to this particular conference. And so it was put on my heart, it literally in the middle of the night broke me up out of my sleep, and basically said, you know what, let's go ahead and figure out how to actually put a conference together, a virtual conference together, that looks at the impact of gentrification on historic and cultural preservation. You end up with neighborhoods like Bronzeville where they're tearing stuff down, putting stuff up, and in its place, if it's not a landmark, they're putting a little placard saying, hey, here's a point of interest, right? So the project that I'm working on is coming up with and creating a conference that's virtual, that's affordable to people, to talk about the effects of gentrification on historic and cultural preservation, and what people can do at the community level, people who are doing this work who may not be able to go to these conferences and speak nationally or internationally, giving them a platform to kind of share their experiences, their findings, and then not only, like you said, not just talking about the generational trauma and the experiences, but working towards the healing. So doing the work. What are the next steps? Having people leave from that conference and saying, okay, here's what I can do within my realm and within my sphere to kind of positively shift how this is going. So that's what I'm currently working on.
That's so cool. And if people want to find out more about you, your website has been there the whole time, www.drangelyn.com.
Yes.
So if you want to find out more about what's going on, and also some of the things that you do in the community, please visit Dr. Anderson's website. So with that said, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, I look forward to working together, and everyone have a great evening.
Take care, everyone, and stay inside.
Stay inside during this time.
It's about to make a change. Do it with some soul and a little love. Change. Yeah, it's about the love. Change. Do it with some soul and a little love. Change. You can't make a change unless you got the love. Change. Do it with some soul and a little love. Change. You can't make a change unless you got some love. Change. Do it with some soul and a little love. Change. We started from the bottom, talking about the roots. Every time I'm in the booth, I gotta shoot the truth. My art is my art. It it ain't no shame from it. I'm feeling like Kunta, they'll never take my name from it. History, it's not his story. Instead of ignoring, go explore it, it's so much glory. People forgot, but nigga, I didn't forget it. That's a slap in the face to anybody that actually lived it. They talk slick, talk shit, they talk quick. All that shit is bullshit because it's fucking toxic. I'm shocking people with new facts like my name is Raiden. Cooking up the soul with Ruler Y, ain't no apron. Yeah, check it, it's about to make a change. Do it with some soul and a little love change. Yeah, it's about to let it change. Do it with some soul and a little love change. You can't make a change unless you got the love change. Do it with some soul and a little love change. You can't make a change unless you got some love change. Do it with some soul and a little love change. I'm connected to my culture like I got a twin. Identical to a turntable with a different spin. Time don't change people, people change people. They say it's so balanced, but it really ain't equal. Everything the same, it's a lyrical imbalance. Never mistake making money with actual talent. Some of y'all do it for the streets, do it for the peeps. I do it for the people that's working 40 every week. Nothing this way but positive vibes. Everything that I write or I try to describe, put it on my life, put my life on the line. Every time that I rhyme, I never deprive, admit the lies. Yeah, check it, it's about to make a change. Do it with some soul and a little